On the morning of July 4th, 1983, while most of America prepared for parades and fireworks, a car pulled up to the emergency entrance of a small hospital in Allegan County, Michigan. Inside was a 12-year-old boy named John Yarbough. He wasn't breathing. He had no pulse. Several men laid him on the hospital steps and drove him away. And by the time he was carried through the hospital doors, it was already too late. This is the story of how a search for God led to a small, isolated camp in the woods of Michigan. It's the story of a charismatic leader who promised salvation, and the families who believed him. But beneath the promises, a system of absolute control was being built. A system that would demand obedience, enforce it with brutal violence, and ultimately cost a young boy his life. And when the truth was finally exposed, it would force the American legal system to confront a terrifying question. What is the line between faith and fear? And what is the difference between a commune and a slave camp? The date itself is a tragic irony. On the day America celebrates its independence, the life of a child who had known very little freedom came to a quiet and brutal end. At approximately 6 a.m. on July 4th, 1983, John Yarbough was pronounced dead at Douglas Hospital, but the doctors and nurses who attended to him immediately knew something was wrong. The official report from the Allegan County Medical Examiner would later confirm their suspicions, placing his time of death hours earlier, somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m. That 4 to 6 hour gap between when John died and when he was brought to the hospital was the first crack in the story that his family would tell. A story that would soon unravel to reveal a nightmare. When the police were called, they were met by members of the Yarbough family who lived at a nearby religious settlement called the House of Judah. At first, the case seemed tragically straightforward. During questioning, John's mother admitted that she'd beaten her son the previous day, on July 3rd. It appeared to be a horrific but contained case of fatal child abuse. Acting swiftly to protect the other children, police took John's 5 siblings into temporary custody, removing them from what the law calls an unfit place for such child to live in. The initial mystery, who was responsible for the death of John Yarbough, seemed to be solved, but as investigators began to peel back the layers of life inside the House of Judah, they realized the mother's confession was not the end of the story, but the beginning. The beating wasn't a singular act of a parent losing control. It was an execution of a sentence, a punishment carried out as part of a rigid, codified system of discipline that wasn't only sanctioned, but was demanded by the community's leader. This realization transformed the entire scope of the investigation. The focus shifted from the actions of one woman to the culture of an entire group. At a preliminary hearing just days later, the presiding probate judge made a critical decision. After hearing testimony about the camp and observing the behavior of its leader, he ruled there was cause to investigate the welfare of all 66 children living on the 22-acre compound. This was a clear signal from the authorities. They understood that the danger wasn't confined to a single trailer. The entire community was potentially an unfit place, an environment where the fundamental duty of a parent to protect their child had been systematically dismantled and replaced by a duty to obey. The question was no longer just what happened to John Yarbough, but what was the House of Judah, and how could a community of nearly 100 people stand by and even participate as its children were brutalized in the name of God? To understand how a place like the House of Judah could exist, we have to understand the void it promised to fill. The group was part of a larger, complex, and diverse movement known as the Black Hebrew Israelites. Emerging in the late 19th century, the movement was born from the profound trauma of slavery and the systemic racism of Jim Crow laws and segregation that followed. It offered a powerful and restorative answer to a people whose history and identity had been systematically erased. The core belief is that African Americans are the literal, biological descendants of the ancient biblical Israelites, the true chosen people of God. For many, this wasn't just a religious belief. It was a reclamation of a stolen heritage. It provided a divine narrative, a sense of historical importance, and a framework for understanding centuries of suffering. Passages from the Bible, for instance, like Deuteronomy 28, which describes the curses that would befall a disobedient Israel, included being scattered and sold into bondage on ships. And this was interpreted as a direct prophecy of the transatlantic slave trade. In a society that long villainized and marginalized black identity, The Black Hebrew Israelite movement offered a counter-narrative of ultimate significance and divine purpose. It was within this fertile ground of spiritual searching that a man named William A. Lewis planted his own seeds of power. Lewis was an ordinary man from Chicago, a former appliance repairman and barber. But in 1966, he founded the House of Judah and began to transform himself into something more. He became my Lord Prophet David Israel. His theology was a potent distillation of Black Hebrew Israelite beliefs, supercharged with his own messianic importance. He taught that he was God's sole representative on earth, and that membership in the House of Judah was the one and only path to salvation. Then in 1975, Lewis made a crucial strategic move. He relocated his growing flock from the sprawling, anonymous environment of Chicago to a secluded 22-acre camp in a remote, rural part of Allegan County, Michigan. In those early days, the camp did have an almost idyllic veneer. One former member recalled, "It started out beautifully, like most things." About 100 followers lived in roughly 30 trailers spread across the property, without electricity or running water. Families worked together to raise livestock and crops, homeschool their children, and study the scriptures. The compound had two houses, one for Lewis and the other for a woman he deemed the prophetess, Muriel King. And they had simple communal facilities like a meeting hall and a classroom. Everything on the grounds was painted in the community's signature colors of blue and white, giving the settlement a distinctive but almost festive appearance. Daily life was highly regimented. Everyone had chores or work assignments, tending to the camp's farm animals and garden, cooking communal meals, cleaning the grounds, or helping with construction projects. Even the children had work details once they were big enough. In fact, it was skipping a chore that would later seal young John's fate, as we'll soon see. Prayer and religious classes were held regularly, where Lewis or his lieutenants would preach. Using his own brand of Old Testament preaching, Lewis had argued that only a handful, including his followers, were the real Jews, while others were the heathens, one account noted. He drummed into them a worldview where the outside world was evil. The House of Judah taught that all white people were devils, and black people outside the cult were heathens who didn't know the truth. This doctrine served to justify the group's isolation and hostile actions toward outsiders. It also meant that when neighbors or even police would come around, members literally saw them as agents of Satan, something that became very relevant when authorities would later intervene. The families in the camp grew larger each year because Lewis forbade birth control and encouraged having as many children as possible, to be fruitful and multiply. Each time you have a child is a blessing, is what he taught, and his flock took it to heart. In just the 4 years leading up to 1983, at least 26 babies were born to 16 women on the camp, a birth rate about 3 times higher than the surrounding county. Children were everywhere, running in packs among the trailers. They were truly the lifeblood of the community, future devotees born directly into the faith. But raising so many children in isolation put a strain on the group's finances. Large families and few job opportunities in rural Allegan meant that families depended on welfare and food stamps to survive, money that ultimately helped fund the cult itself. At one point, authorities determined that half of the households in the cult were receiving public assistance. For example, John Yarbough's mother, Ethel, was getting about $660 a month in aid to families with dependent children benefits, plus food stamps for her large family. But the House of Judah's prophet had his own tithing system. Members had to kick in 10% of any welfare checks to a common camp fund. On top of that, they were charged fees for everything. Road tithes to maintain the dirt, fees for firewood, even a $300 per family levy to buy a van for the prophet's use. On weekends, communal meals were cooked, but followers had to pay to eat, about $5.50 per adult and $3 per child, from their own scant resources. In essence, all money flowed upward towards William Lewis, keeping members financially dependent and their leader financially secure. But early on, this wasn't seen as a red flag. They saw themselves as a family, and you share with family. Members genuinely believed they were building something pure and righteous. Yet even in those early days, there were signs of what the House of Judah would become. William Lewis was not a man used to having his authority questioned. As the prophet, he expected absolute obedience to his interpretation of the Bible. Members of the camp addressed him with reverence. and some would later recount how he subtly began isolating them from outside influences. He preached that the outside world was evil, and that salvation could only be found within the group under his strict guidance. Little by little, he encouraged followers to cut off contact with skeptical relatives and former friends. The first thing they do is break you off from your family. We are your family, former member Celia Green would say of the cult's method. That's a cult, but I didn't know that then. Despite the subtle control that was slowly being exerted over them, it seems like the group found what they'd been seeking. In the federal trial that would come years later, a key piece of testimony emerged from a former member who described the early years at the camp, from mid to late 1970s, as warm, cooperative, and friendly. This detail is vital. It tells us that the House of Judah wasn't a nightmare from its inception. It was, for a while, a functioning community that fulfilled its promise of sanctuary. It explains why people were drawn to it, why they uprooted their lives to move to a remote field in Michigan, and why they stayed. They believed they'd found their promised land. This idyllic image makes the reality of what followed all the more horrifying. We now understand why people would join, but it opens a new, more disturbing loop in our story. We're left with a stark contrast between a warm, cooperative community and the cold, bruised body of a 12-year-old boy. What happened inside that isolated camp to transform a place of peace into a place of pain? How did a prophet of salvation become an architect of terror? By 1981, roughly 6 years into the House of Judah's experiment in communal living, a dark transformation was underway. William Lewis had become convinced that his flock was straying from the rigid path he'd set. Maybe he noticed minor acts of independence or dissent, a question here, a rule bent there, and it threatened his sense of control. And in response, the self-proclaimed prophet decided to make an example of disobedience. So he declared that the community was falling into sin and needed severe purification, and thus began the reign of punishment at the House of Judah. Lewis introduced a formal system of corporal punishment that he claimed was grounded in Scripture, a literal Old Testament brand of justice. In early 1982, he went so far as to compel every adult member of the camp to sign a document pledging total acceptance of any punishment deemed necessary for sins against God, which in practice meant sins against Lewis's rules. The contents of this document were terrifying. It listed possible penalties including beating, imprisonment, banishment, burning, hanging, stoning, even death, not only for the offending member but also for their children. In other words, a parent who broke a rule was effectively agreeing that their son or daughter could be beaten or worse as part of God's judgment. It's hard to imagine a more blatant perversion of parental instinct. Yet in the insulated world of the cult, many signed without protest, seeing it just as another step towards salvation. By then, Lewis had so elevated himself in the eyes of his followers that his decrees were treated as divine orders. With this grim contract in hand, Lewis wasted no time establishing a climate of fear to enforce his will. He ordered the construction of a wooden whipping block, fashioned like old colonial stocks, where those accused of misdeeds would be locked up by the head and hands to be publicly flogged. The implement of choice for these beatings was either a wooden switch or a heavy axe handle that the group named Big Mac, a piece of wood capable of inflicting profound pain and injury. According to later court testimony, it was Lewis and a few close lieutenants who orchestrated the punishments, but he often made parents carry them out on their own children or spouses. This served two purposes. It both implicated the family in the violence, binding them tighter to the cult out of guilt or fear, and it demonstrated the total dominance of the prophet's rules over natural family bonds. Soon, beatings became routine spectacles at the camp. Lewis would proclaim someone's spiritual failing before the congregation, and the offender, whether adult or child, would be brought forward to the whipping block. If a child was accused, their parent might be ordered to administer the lashes as the community watched. Former members later described how the victim's screams would echo through the camp, punctuated by the crack of wood against flesh. Unbelievably, these public punishments often drew cheers from onlookers who'd been conditioned to see this brutality as righteous correction. A retired FBI agent who investigated the cult remarked, "I've seen a lot of brutality in this job, but that was about as brutal as I've ever seen." The most powerful evidence of what this system looked like in practice came from the children who survived it. Daniel Yarbough, John's younger brother, recounted an incident when he was just 7 or 8 years old. One of his younger half-brothers had been accidentally burned while in his care. As a form of biblical eye for an eye retribution, Prophet Lewis ordered Daniel to be punished. 3 men held him down while one of them pressed a hot iron to his face. But the horror didn't end there. At the next religious service, the prophet forced the young boy to stand up before the entire congregation and display his scarred flesh, a public lesson written on a child's skin. It's interesting to note that the child Daniel was punished for letting get burned was actually the prophet's son, while Daniel, John, and their older siblings had different fathers. I have to wonder if the punishment would have been as harsh had the injured party not been Lewis's own flesh and blood, but who knows. The final straw finally came on July 4th of 1983. For John Yarbough, life in the House of Judah was all he'd ever known. At 12 years old, John was one of 6 children being raised at the camp by his mother Ethel, a devoted member of the cult. By Lewis's account, almost fanatically so. She was known for being very faithful in raising her kids, Lewis would later say, which included regular beatings. To Ethel, harsh discipline was an expression of love. She truly believed she was saving her children's souls from sin by putting the rod on the child's back, as God commanded. But John was reaching an age where he began to push back in small ways. Court testimony revealed that John had even begged his mother to let him leave the camp to live with his grandmother in Missouri. He was miserable, and he wanted out, but Ethel refused, partly because John's elderly grandmother was in poor health, but likely also because leaving would mean taking him outside the family of the cult, something strictly forbidden. After that, there was a noticeable change in John. His whole attitude changed, one cult member would later testify. He grew sullen, depressed, resistant. If he didn't get his way, he would sulk, refuse to eat, even deliberately soil himself. Small acts of defiance by a boy who felt trapped. In the last week of June 1983, John's frustration and the cult's rigid rules collided in a tragic way. On June 29, 1983, John was assigned to a work detail, cleaning out a trailer that had been occupied by a former member. At lunchtime, John took a break and didn't return to work. Maybe he snuck off to watch some TV, as later reports suggested. Or maybe he just hid to get a moment of peace. Skipping chores, though, was a serious infraction in the House of Judah. When John was found slacking off, 2 adult members of the camp, Larry Branson and Theodore Jones, took it upon themselves to enforce punishment. They dragged John to the camp's homemade stocks, the wooden restraining device we described earlier, and locked him in. John's head, hands, and feet were immobilized in the contraption, leaving him utterly defenseless. The men then picked up a sturdy tree limb, about 3 to 4 feet long, and began to whip him. John screamed and struggled, but trapped in the stocks, he could barely move. Branson and Jones later testified that they struck John about 30 times with that tree limb. 30 heavy blows on a 12-year-old child's body. When they finally released him, John was bruised and in agony, but this was only round 1 of his ordeal. Crucially, Branson and Jones didn't inform John's mother that they'd already punished him. In the twisted logic of the cult, John's misdeeds still needed to be addressed by his parent to be squared with the rules. So several hours later, that same day or the next, Ethel Yarbough, who was heavily pregnant at the time, proceeded to give her son another beating, unaware that his body was already battered, which just goes to show how much they were actually beaten if the parent couldn't even tell. In court, Ethel admitted she struck John about 4 times with a broomstick on July 3rd to try to discipline him. She initially told authorities it was because he'd refused to eat. Later, she claimed it was because she wanted him to exercise. So the story changed, perhaps reflecting her own confusion or an attempt to minimize her actions. Regardless, a doctor who examined John afterward would testify that the beating was so severe it shredded the skin on his buttocks. It was far beyond a mild spanking. It was a vicious thrashing, even if Ethel, in her mind, downplayed it as just a few licks with a broom handle. But John's punishment didn't even end there. According to another member, Celia Green, on July 2nd, which was between the initial June 29th incident and Ethel's final beating, there was yet another episode of cruelty. Celia testified that she saw John being dragged to the camp's gymnasium by several cult members. In this makeshift gym, away from the eyes of any who might sympathize, a group of adults set upon John again. They punched him in the head with their fists and struck his back with a stick. In the frenzy, the boy fell backward and smacked his head against a large freezer that was stored in the gym. We can only imagine John's suffering at that point. Multiple beatings over consecutive days, head trauma, with no medical attention or comfort. By the night of July 3rd, 1983, John Yarbough was grievously injured. He had welts and lacerations from his neck to his thighs. Internally, he probably had severe internal bleeding or organ damage. He collapsed in his family's trailer, and by the early hours of July 4th, he could no longer move or speak. Sometime during that night, John died in his bed. A 12-year-old boy's life, violently cut short because he failed to do a chore and dared to act out in despair. But John Yarbough's death did what years of rumors and red flags could not. It brought the full attention of law enforcement and child protective services crashing down on the House of Judah. In the days immediately following the 12-year-old's killing, authorities removed all 66 children from the compound for their safety. Imagine the scene on that day. Convoys of police cars and social workers arriving at the remote camp on Baseline Road. Armed officers, many of them white, stepping into a world painted blue and white where children had been taught to fear the outside. Those kids must have been terrified, seeing the faces of the very devils their prophet had long warned them about. One psychologist later noted how traumatic that rescue likely was. The children probably thought, the devil's taking us away, just like the prophet said. Yet, as frightful as it was for those young ones, it was also the start of their deliverance from a life of abuse. Officials found that many of the children bore bruises, scars, and other signs of abuse. They also encountered malnourishment and neglect. These boys and girls had been forced to work long hours and had never been allowed to attend public school, leaving them educationally years behind their peers. Now, suddenly they were in protective custody, being examined by doctors and questioned gently by social workers about what had happened in the House of Judah. The accounts that emerged were harrowing, and they corroborated each other. Beatings with axe handles, public whippings and stocks, children as young as 6 or 7 being beaten or burned. Meanwhile, the Allegan County Sheriff and Michigan State Police turned their investigation to identifying and charging those responsible for John's death. In August 1983, within weeks of the incident, Michigan prosecutors charged 7 members of the House of Judah in connection with the fatal beating. William A. Lewis, the prophet himself, was among those charged, specifically with child cruelty for having allowed or encouraged the abuse. John's mother, Ethel Yarbough, was charged and would eventually face trial for involuntary manslaughter, since witnesses indicated she delivered the last beating that led to John's collapse. Other members, likely including the men who directly wielded Big Mac, were charged with assault and lesser offenses related to the abuse. The state trial in 1984 was the first public unmasking of this House of Judah. The prosecutors methodically laid out the evidence, the testimony of survivors, the bruises on the children, the grisly punishment contract that Lewis made everyone sign, and the blood-stained whipping block taken from the camp as an exhibit. The community watched in horror as news reports described a cult in their midst that operated like a medieval fortress. It was hard to fathom that such things had occurred in southwest Michigan in the 1980s. This case even made national headlines, shining a light on the broader issue of child abuse within cults and fringe religious sects. In the end, Michigan's justice system did hold some of the perpetrators accountable, but not all of them. John's mother Ethel was convicted of involuntary manslaughter in her son's death. She wept in court as the verdict was read, perhaps finally awakening to the reality of what she'd done. The judge sentenced her to 4 to 15 years in prison, of which she served the minimum. 2 other cult members, Larry Branson and Theodore Jones, the 2 who directly participated in beating John, were convicted on related charges of child abuse or assault, according to contemporary reports. However, William Lewis himself managed to escape conviction at the state level. The jury acquitted Lewis of the child cruelty charge in John's case. It seems jurors weren't entirely convinced that he was legally responsible for the murder since he hadn't personally swung the weapon. Similarly, charges against Lewis's adult son, William Lewis Jr., and a few others were dropped or resulted in acquittals. This outcome was deeply frustrating for law enforcement. They'd removed the children and punished the immediate culprits. But the prophet, the man who'd created this deadly system, walked away free from that courtroom, still in command of his flock. The verdict was a blow to the community, and a legal travesty. The men who'd beaten a child to death would be free in a year. The prophet, The man who'd ordered the beatings and created the entire system of terror faced no charges at all. The mystery of how the camp operated had been solved, its horrors laid bare by the testimony of a child. But the resolution was hollow, and so a new, burning question emerged. Is this it? Is this all the justice that John Yarbough and the other brutalized children of the House of Judah will ever get? Enter Jean Debot, a local FBI agent with something of a stubborn streak for justice. Jean was deeply disturbed by the House of Judah case. After Lewis slipped through the state charges, Jean took the unusual step of seeking out a federal prosecutor on his own initiative. He literally went and found Susan King, a Department of Justice civil rights attorney, while she was busy trying an unrelated case in Ann Arbor, Michigan. He urged her to take a look at the House of Judah situation, saying, in essence, "You have to do something about this." What Jean had in mind was trying to use federal civil rights laws, specifically laws against involuntary servitude, slavery, and conspiracy to violate civil rights, to go after Lewis and his top followers. This was a bold move. Such statutes had rarely, if ever, been used in a cult child abuse context. As Susan King later recalled, it was not at the time typical for an FBI agent to do that in a slavery case. This one was different from the rest. Legally complicated with the religious overtones, and by the facts the victims were in the custody of their parents. In other words, how do you claim slavery when the victims are minors who are technically under their parental control? It was a novel legal theory that required proving that Lewis and his lieutenants had willfully deprived those children of their rights by forcing them to stay and labor at the camp through fear and violence, effectively treating them as slaves. Despite the challenges, King and another DOJ attorney, Daniel Bell, decided it was worth attempting. They recognized that the House of Judah case could set a precedent, one that would show you could enslave a child even if they were still in the custody of their parents, as King would later put it. Over the next couple of years, they built a federal case targeting William Lewis and several of his high-ranking followers for enslaving the children of the House of Judah. They would argue that the entire environment at the camp was one of involuntary servitude. The children, and arguably the adults too, could not leave, were forced to work under threat of brutal punishment, and were held as prisoners by armed guards and padlocks. This, they said, violated federal civil rights laws, specifically 18 U.S.C. section 241 to 242, conspiracy to deprive rights, and section 1584, holding someone to involuntary servitude. Laws originally designed to prosecute modern-day slavery and peonage. The 20-day federal bench trial began in August of 1986. Because the defendants waived their rights to a jury, their fate rested in the hands of a single person, Chief Judge Douglas W. Hillman. The prosecution laid out its case, built on the powerful testimony of former members, including the child survivors Daniel Yarbough and Antoine Anderson. They argued that the constant brutal beatings, the public shamings, the armed guards, the mail censorship, and the restrictions on movement created an environment where the children were psychologically imprisoned. They contended that the parents' supposed consent was legally meaningless, as the parents themselves were captives of the same coercive system, with their own wills subjugated to that of the prophet. The defense countered by framing the case as a matter of religious freedom, protected by the First Amendment. They argued that the beatings weren't abuse, but biblically mandated chastisement, a legitimate practice based on their literal interpretation of the Old Testament. They insisted that the parents had willingly consented to this form of discipline for their children. This defense strategy brought a fundamental tension in American law into sharp focus, the line where protected religious practice ends and criminal conduct begins. In his final verdict, Judge Hillman addressed this tension directly. He began by acknowledging the defendants' rights, stating, "This country thrives on diversity. First Amendment rights are sacred. The fact that middle-class American public opinion may hate and despise the religious teachings of the House of Judah has had no effects in my efforts to analyze the charges." But he then drew a firm line. The right to believe, he affirmed, is absolute. The right to act on those beliefs is not, especially when those actions cause harm. He found the testimony of the child survivors to be bright, alert, and credible, and provided a vivid picture of camp conditions. He concluded that the prosecution had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that a climate of fear existed throughout the camp. He ruled that William Lewis and 6 of his co-defendants were guilty of conspiring to hold children in involuntary servitude. Justice, which had been denied at the state level, was finally delivered. The federal government had succeeded by correctly identifying the true nature of the crime. This wasn't just a case of child cruelty, it was a case of slavery. The prophet and his lieutenants weren't just punished for a single act, but for the entire regime of terror that they had created and enforced. The final loop of the story was closed. The question of whether there would be real justice for John Yarbough had been answered with a resounding yes. The federal convictions brought a sense of legal finality to the story of the House of Judah, but for the children who lived through it, the end of the trial was just the beginning of a lifelong process of recovery. The aftermath of the camp's collapse is, in many ways, just as complex and haunting as the events that led to its downfall. One of the most unsettling facts is what happened to the 66 children who were removed from the compound. After the initial investigation in 1983, the state entered into an agreement with the parents. In exchange for the parents agreeing to a set of court-ordered stipulations, which included ending excessive physical punishment and allowing social workers to inspect the camp, more than half were returned to their families by mid-October 1983, just a mere 3.5 months after John's death. The Yarbough siblings were split up among homes, with Daniel and David going to live with an aunt in Chicago. LaToya stayed with 2 of her younger half-brothers in a foster home because her aunt wanted nothing to do with the younger kids who were the prophet's offspring. The 2-year-old was placed with yet another foster family. From the outside, this decision can seem shocking. Why return children to the very environment where such horrific abuse occurred? The answer lies in a core but often controversial principle of family law, the preservation of the family unit. The legal system often operates under the assumption that the best place for a child is with their parents, provided that the environment can be made safe. The court may have viewed the parents as victims themselves, but it leaves a lingering unanswerable question. Was a court order enough to undo years of psychological indoctrination and to break a deeply ingrained cycle of abuse? While there are few public interviews with the children of the House of Judah, understandably, decades of research into the psychological effects of growing up in high-control groups gives us a clear picture of the immense challenges that they would have faced. Children raised in such environments are often denied the chance to form a stable, independent identity. Their sense of self is completely enmeshed with the group's ideology. When they leave, they can experience profound identity confusion, feeling lost, unable to navigate a world where they were taught to fear and mistrust. The psychological scars are deep and varied: complex post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic anxiety and depression, difficulty forming healthy attachments and trusting others, and a pervasive sense of guilt and shame. One of the most insidious wounds is the deliberate destruction of the parent-child bond. In a cult, the leader systematically replaces the parent as the child's primary source of authority, love, and security. Parents are often shamed and humiliated in front of their children, who learn their parents are powerless and that only the leader is worthy of admiration. Rebuilding that broken trust is a monumental task. William Lewis emerged from prison in 1991, having served roughly 3 years of his sentence in a federal facility in Texas. By then he was in his early 60s, and one might wonder, would prison and the passage of time soften this zealot's heart? Well, the answer is a resounding no. If anything, Lewis returned more radical and embittered than before, but now his cult was a shell of its former self. Lewis did find a small number of followers still holding on to the House of Judah identity in Alabama, where he'd relocated them after the state trial in 1984. The community had indeed kept a low profile during his incarceration. The local sheriff noted that the children at the camp were finally attending public schools, something that the judge in the slavery trial had pointed out the group previously refused to allow. This indicates that without Lewis's daily control, his followers probably relaxed some rules, probably out of necessity. Lewis would soon grab headlines in Alabama in the most paradoxical way. In early 1991, news broke that William Lewis, a black man who preached black separatist theology, wanted to join a march led by a group notorious for wearing white hoods, which YouTube probably wouldn't want me to name out loud. Yes, you heard that right. Lewis publicly stated that he admired this group's stance on racial separation. "To me, they're about the truest organization in the country," he was quoted as saying of the group. This bizarre announcement was probably a publicity stunt and a reflection of Lewis's increasingly warped racial theories. During his time in prison, he'd apparently added a new grievance to his list: race mixing. He proclaimed that God destroyed the world with Noah's flood because of interracial relationships, and even claimed that humanity's lifespans were shortened by God as a punishment for mixing races. In Lewis's mind, if not for race mixing, people would live 600 years or more. a statement without biblical basis but illustrative of his extremist views. These pronouncements put him oddly in alignment with white supremacist ideologies, hence his overture to the group with white pointy hats. They unsurprisingly did not reciprocate the affection. Their leader organizing the march flatly rejected the House of Judah's participation, likely not wanting black participants even if they professed similar separatist beliefs. Despite such radical talk, in day-to-day life the House of Judah's second incarnation remained relatively small and contained. In 1993 and 1994, trouble struck again though, this time from within Lewis's own family. One of his teenage sons and some of that son's friends were arrested for a string of robberies in the surrounding counties. They'd stolen a number of guns during these burglaries, which police later discovered were stashed on the House of Judah property and at a nearby teen's home. Even more concerning though, the ATF was called in because about half of those firearms had been sawed off or had their serial numbers filed off, making them illegal weapons. It appears that in Lewis's absence, or perhaps after his return, the remaining members still maintained an armory and possibly trained their youth to use weapons, whether for criminal activity or security is unclear. But the fact that the stolen guns ended up with the House of Judah suggests the cult's continued distrust of outsiders and willingness to arm itself. By the mid-1990s, Lewis was aging. One report in '94 described him as 74 years old and in ill health. The active leadership of the cult may have been passed on to others, or maybe it just dwindled. People left quietly, especially as Lewis's prophecies of apocalypse kept not coming true. And that brings us to the end of William Lewis's story. The prophet died in August 2004 in Wetumpka, Alabama. He was about 84 years old. The man who once grabbed national headlines as the leader of a child-beating cult quietly died in obscurity, having spent his final years as a bitter old man, preaching to a shrinking, disillusioned flock. In the end, the story of the House of Judah is more than just a shocking true crime case. It's a profound and tragic cautionary tale. It began with people searching for something that all of us in one way or another seek: a sense of identity, a community to belong to, a feeling of purpose, and an answer to life's great spiritual questions. William Lewis offered his followers a simple and absolute answer. The trap is laid with charm and hope, and only later do the fangs of control emerge, but by then it's incredibly hard to leave because the group holds all the cards. In the House of Judah, not only did Lewis psychologically control everyone with fear, but he physically controlled them with armed guards and diminishing their financial resources and using their own family bonds against them. Adults who wanted to leave would have to be willing to leave their children behind. In cults like this, leaving starts to seem like a no-win situation. If you or a loved one is experiencing something similar to this, there are resources available to help. I'm going to link an article in the description that could be a good place to start. The Definitive Guide to Helping People Trapped in a Cult. The tragedy of John Yarbough reminds us of the profound human vulnerability that cults exploit. It serves as a stark warning about the dangers of surrendering critical thought to any single leader, ideology, or group that claims to have all the answers. Thank you for listening to this deep dive into the House of Judah cult. It's been a difficult story, but it's an important one. Remember to stay informed and to stay compassionate, because understanding is a step towards prevention. If you believe we've earned it, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing this content with your friends. As a small channel, viewers like you truly do make a massive difference. Thank you. I'll see you in the next video.